Идея лингвистических форумов возникла в 2019 году, и это конференции, которые посвящены общественно значимым темам лингвистики, таким темам, которые одновременно относятся к ведению науки о языке и вызывают значимый общественный интерес и для широкого круга людей объясняют, чем занимаются лингвисты, почему эта наука важна. Сейчас у нас открывается третий форум, который посвящен языковой политике и языковому разнообразию. Эта проблематика в последнее время привлекает широкое общественное внимание. Я думаю, всем известно, что начиная со следующего года объявлено десятилетие коренных языков Организации Объединенных Наций. Это будет широко отмечаться, и этим будут широко заниматься в России, в том числе. В начале 2020 года было опубликовано поручение президента России, в котором были важные аспекты, связанные с нашей тематикой. Во-первых, там была обозначена программа Института языкознания по сохранению и возрождению языков России. И начиная с этого года мы в Институте языкознания активно занимаемся подготовкой этой программы. Также в поручении президента была обозначена необходимость создать концепцию языковой политики для нашей страны. И Институт языкознания в содружестве с 3 другими академическими институтами подготовил проект такой концепции, который, я думаю, будет обсуждаться. И все это является естественным фоном для нашего форума, который мы сейчас открываем. Лингвисты в этой проблематике языковой политики играют двоякую роль. Во-первых, мы изучаем практику языковых политик разных стран, разных сообществ, разных групп, даже семей. Семья может иметь свою языковую политику. И также лингвисты призваны давать научные рекомендации по поводу разумной языковой политики. Как лучше ее строить, чтобы это было полезно для общества, для сохранения языков и так далее. Ну вот это самые общие слова, предшествующие началу нашего форума. А теперь я хотел бы зачитать приветствие участникам форума, которое было прислано советником президента Владимиром Ильичем Толстым. Глубоко уважаемые коллеги, искренне рад приветствовать участников и организаторов международной конференции «Лингвистический форум-2021. Языковая политика и сохранение языков». Сохранение языков народов России для нашей страны жизненно важно. Не случайно обновленной Конституцией Российской Федерации сохранение этнокультурного и языкового многообразия отнесено к первейшим обязанностям государства. Информационная эпоха, в которую нам довелось жить, открывает уникальные возможности для исследования и познания законов языков человечества, но одновременно все больше разрушает традиционное языковое пространство и условия естественной жизни языков. Именно объединение усилий ученых в поиске наиболее точных и действенных подходов к решению этих сложнейших задач может и должно стать основой для выработки государством наиболее эффективной системы сохранения и развития языков народов нашей страны, а значит для сохранения единства и целостности многонационального российского народа. Не сомневаюсь, что ваша конференция станет важным шагом на этом пути. От души желаю вам плодотворной работы на конференции, удачи и успехов каждому из вас. С глубоким уважением, советник президента Российской Федерации Владимир Толстой. Кстати сказать, Владимир Ильич хотел участвовать в нашем открытии лично, но по совпадению сегодня отмечается 200-летие Достоевского, и он участвует в мероприятии по этому поводу. И в этой связи я нашел хорошую цитату из Федора Михайловича, которая могла бы послужить одним из эпиграфов для нашей работы. В дневнике писателя за 1876 год Достоевский сказал так: «Только лишь усвоив в возможном совершенстве первоначальный материал, то есть родной язык, мы в состоянии будем в возможном же совершенстве усвоить и язык иностранный». Ну, к этому я добавлю не только иностранный, но и вообще другой язык, второй, третий и так далее. Также у нас есть приветствие от Валерия Николаевича Фалькова, министра науки и высшего образования, которое я также зачитаю. Уважаемые коллеги, приветствую вас на международной конференции «Лингвистический форум 2021. Языковая политика и сохранение языков». Ежегодный форум Института языкознания РАН посвящен актуальным и общественно значимым вопросам лингвистики, вносит существенный вклад в развитие профессиональной дискуссии, помогает установить прочные связи между российскими и зарубежными вузами и научными организациями. Обсуждение проблем языковой политики, роли общественных организаций и семьи, сохранение языкового разнообразия и возрождение языков России являются важным аспектом в реализации государственной политики в сфере межнациональных отношений. Уверен, что онлайн-формат мероприятия будет способствовать расширению круга участников форума, сохранению и развитию функциональных стилей и сфер употребления языков России и мира. Желаю вам плодотворной работы и профессиональных успехов. Министр науки и высшего образования Российской Федерации Фальков. Спасибо и Владимиру Ильичу и Валерию Николаевичу за присланные содержательные приветствия. Теперь я хотел бы предоставить слово заместителю руководителя Федерального агентства по делам национальностей России Станиславу Анатольевичу Беткину, который здесь присутствует. Пожалуйста, Станислав Анатольевич.
Да, спасибо большое, Андрей Александрович. Дорогие друзья, я от имени Федерального агентства по делам национальности рад приветствовать организаторов, участников конференции. Выбранная в этом году тема форума особенно актуальна. Языковая политика по-прежнему находится под пристальным вниманием как общественности, так и органов государственной власти. Напомню, что одним из приоритетов государственной национальной политики Российской Федерации определенных стратегий является сохранение языкового разнообразия. Именно поэтому, как уже сегодня говорилось, в рамках поручения президента Российской Федерации разрабатывается концепция государственной языковой политики. Мы считаем, что она должна быть, безусловно, выставлена на широкое общественное обсуждение, и к разработке должны быть подключены все заинтересованные федеральные органы исполнительной власти. Большая работа по сохранению и популяризации языков будет проводиться и в рамках провозглашенного Генеральной Ассамблеей ООН в 22-32 годах Международного десятилетия языков коренных народов. Я подчеркну, что Россия стала первой страной, которая учредила национальный оргкомитет, и он уже разработал проект плана мероприятий по проведению в Российской Федерации Международного десятилетия. А совсем недавно, в октябре, состоялось его первое заседание, и на нем как раз этот проект плана был рассмотрен. Еще одним важным направлением деятельности в рамках проведения десятилетия станет формирование Всемирного атласа языков. Это одно из ключевых мероприятий ЮНЕСКО, и необходимо, чтобы наши языки наших народов были там достойно представлены. Я желаю всем участникам, гостям конференции плодотворной работы и достижения тех целей, которые вы поставили. Спасибо.
Спасибо большое, Станислав Анатольевич, и за ваше приветствие и за то, что вы нашли возможным, нашли время поучаствовать в нашем открытии. И теперь я хотел бы предоставить слово первому заместителю председателя Комитета Государственной Думы по делам национальностей Ильдару Ирековичу Гильмуддинову, который также присутствует среди нас. Пожалуйста, Ильдар Ирекович.
Добрый день. Спасибо большое. Меня слышно?
Слышно.
Спасибо большое. Александр Александрович, мое присутствие здесь, наверное, в большей степени как приветствие. Я не хотел бы глубоко уходить в ту проблематику, которая существует сегодня в сохранении родных языков, особенно языков малочисленных коренных народов, но считаю, что проведение таких форумов, анализ, аналитика со стороны ученых, специалистов, она очень важна, очень нужна и необходима. И, конечно, нам бы хотелось, чтобы такие события были более чаще, потому что практически, как мы всегда говорим, там каждые 2 недели исчезает в мире один язык. И вы знаете, что наши родные языки, большое количество которых находится на грани исчезновения или около этой границы. Конечно, нам, профильному комитету, который отслеживает эту ситуацию и старается активно участвовать в формировании нормативной правовой базы, очень важны ваши предложения. Я это не скрываю. У нас тоже накопился большой материал, связанный с этой тематикой. Возможно, я предлагаю институту этот материал использовать совместно, может быть, опубликовать в каких-то ваших, значит, документах, я не знаю, там, материалах, журналах, альманах, тот материал, который мы готовы активно им поделиться. Очень есть интересные, скажем так, материалы, документы, которые реально показывают состояние в стране языковой ситуации. И я в ближайшее время мы тоже совместно с коллегами обсудим сегодняшнее состояние сохранения родных языков, но мне очень хотелось бы, чтобы мы эту тему не перевели только на тему, значит, что говорит общественность, что говорят ученые, чтобы это не осталось только на бумаге, в каких-то научных исследованиях, в каких-то мемуарах, в каких-то ваших решениях. Мне вот лично хотелось бы, чтобы мы от слов, от разговоров о сохранении перешли уже к конкретным действиям, реализации конкретных программ. И они не должны быть наполнены только какими-то конференциями и форумами, но в том числе теми решениями, которые позволят на самом деле сохранить наши родные языки. Их у нас очень много. К сожалению, я должен констатировать, и исполнительная структура, как бы что бы ни говорили, к сожалению, участвует в этом процессе неактивно, от мероприятия до мероприятия. Это касается всех тех, которые задействованы в изучении и сохранении родных языков. Могу напомнить, что сохранение и изучение родных языков является федеральными полномочиями, совместными полномочиями. А сохранение и изучение родных языков коренных малочисленных народов вообще полномочиями федерального центра. Что мы сделали? Для того, чтобы те опасения ученых, специалистов, которые уже давно говорят, и мы об этом говорим, для сохранения. Что? А что у нас есть педагоги? А что у нас есть? Мы даже учебниками не можем до конца сегодня обеспечить те языки, не говорю уже про малочисленные, а те языки, которые в системе образования. До сих пор их нету в полном объеме. Мы давали по нашей инициативе инструмент, который реально помогал бы через финансирование государства в виде фонда языка, родных языков сохранения. И где оно? И что мы сделали? Поэтому у меня, по крайней мере, есть большие претензии, я как говорю как депутат, к нашим коллегам, которые здесь присутствуют и которые не присутствуют здесь, чтобы мы, еще раз говорю, от слов, перешли к конкретным делам. Практически по многим направлениям пути решения определены, болевые точки определены, что нам нужно, необходимо делать в обществе, в семье, государству, какие нормативные документы Значит, как готовить специалистов, через какие инструменты. Мы по ним работаем, нет, сегодня? Или будем опять значит, разговаривать, констатировать факт о том, что тут этого нет, там жалуются. Поверьте, мы получаем каждую, значит, там, неделю обращения, письма, связанные вот с озабоченностью наших граждан, с переживаниями за то, что их родные языки просто исчезают, не то, что сохраняются, просто исчезают. Я благодарю, Андрей Александрович, за вашу инициативу, за такой форум. Имейте в виду, что наш комитет, по крайней мере я, ваш сторонник, всегда готовы прийти к вам на поддержку, но очень хотели бы дальше более совместной интегрированной работы, взаимодействия со всеми институтами, которые этой темой занимаются, с нашей исполнительной структурой, с нашим Федеральным агентством по делам национальности, которое старается и обращает внимание на эту тематику. Очень надеюсь, что у нас все получится. И желаю успешной работы. И думаю, что те решения, те рекомендации, которые вы выработаете, они будут полезны для совместной работы. Спасибо большое.
Спасибо большое, Эльдар Ирекович, и за содержательное выступление, и за явную эмоциональную вовлеченность в эту тематику, которая видна в том, как вы говорите. Конечно, на конференции мы именно будем разговаривать, для этого конференции и придуманы, но практические действия мы также предлагаем, и я буду рад обсудить с вами, с вашими коллегами по комитету и по сотрудниками Государственной Думы конкретику наших предложений в ближайшее время. Dear international participants of the forum, I realize that all that has been said so far might not have been completely intelligible if you don't speak and understand Russian. But it's an objective problem. It's an international conference. It's bilingual conference. And I would like to very briefly summarize what we have been saying so far. I read two greetings from major representatives of the Russian state, including the advisor of the president who is in charge of the language policy in Russia, and also from the Minister of Science and Higher Education. And after that, we heard the greetings from the vice head of the Federal Agency for Ethnic Issues, Affairs, Stanislav Betkin, and also we heard a greeting by the vice head of the committee of the Russian parliament dealing with ethnic affairs, Ildar Gilmudinov. Also, we discussed the structure of this conference, the context of this conference, the social context, and several particular organizational questions have been discussed, and the head of the organizing committee, Andrei Shluinsky, will briefly repeat this information in a minute. I would like to greet all the participants of the forum. Thank you very much for your interest in our conference.
Приветствую всех дорогих наших участников конференции. Спасибо за честь вести первое пленарное заседание. Я буду вести его на английском языке, поскольку у нас англоязычный докладчик и в целом у нас международная конференция. Good morning, dear conference participants. Thank you for joining us at our virtual international conference on such an increasingly important topic as language policy and language preservation. It is my honor to be serving as a plenary sessions chair today. It is also a great pleasure and a great honor to introduce our keynote speaker on this very first day of our conference. This is a very special guest from New Zealand, Professor Stephen May. Stephen May is a professor in School of Maori and Indigenous Education in the Faculty of Education and Social Work at the University of Auckland, New Zealand. He's also a director of the faculties at Te Tai Tokerau campus. So I'm not sure about the pronunciation of the campus name. Sorry if I made a mistake. His contributions to the research field of language rights, language policy, bilingualism, bilingual education, and critical multicultural approaches to education are both impressive and outstanding. Professor May has published 25 books and many articles and chapters in these areas. He is the author of the groundbreaking book, Language and Minority Rights, Ethnicity, Nationalism, and the Politics of Language. The first edition of that book is now regarded as a key benchmark in the field of language rights and language policy. I can even show you that book. So here it is. I have the first edition, which was published in 2001, although since then, the second edition has been issued in 2011. On a more personal note, I would like to mention that I got to know of Dr. Stephen May, not personally, but as a scholar in 2003, when I was about to publish my first paper in English in the journal Language Identity and Education in the USA. That paper entitled Language and Ethnic Identity of Minorities in Post-Soviet Russia, the Buryat Case Study, was finally published in 2004. And during the review process, one of my anonymous reviewers recommended to consult the newly published book by Stephen May, Language and Minority Rights. And I indeed bought that book, read it, and was deeply impressed by the width and depth of the analysis, by how the author reconciled primordial and instrumental approaches to ethnicity in relation to language and culture, employing Pierre Bourdieu's theory. And there were many things I was impressed by. I just don't have time to speak a lot about that book, which I love. To give you the fuller picture of a person who is going to speak now, I should say about other activities Dr. May is engaged in. Apart from being an international authority on language policy and related issues, Professor May is actively engaged in teaching and postgraduate supervision. He taught in universities in New Zealand, Britain, USA, and Canada. For his valuable and prestigious contributions, Professor May has been awarded the Mackenzie Award by the New Zealand Association of Educational Research, the preeminent award for educational research in New Zealand. So now we're all looking forward to listening to Professor May sharing with us his thoughts about minority language maintenance, revitalization, national languages, and the globalization of English. So this is the title of the keynote speech. Please join me to welcome Professor Stephen May. Professor May, you can start now.
Yeah, Professor May, please turn on your microphone.
Thank you so much for your very kind introduction, the Broye Utro. It's a great pleasure and privilege to be with you in your morning and my evening in New Zealand. It's around about 10 hours ahead currently in New Zealand, and Auckland, where I live, is just about to reach its third month in lockdown from COVID. So I haven't been doing a lot of traveling beyond my home, except to go to the shop. And so it's a great pleasure to see so many people, given that it has been quite an isolating time. Thank you for your very kind words, and thank you for the opportunity to speak with you. What I want to do today is just to provide an overview of some of my work, particularly around language rights, and perhaps some potential implications for the Russian Federation, and particularly for its indigenous languages, although I appreciate that there will be many of you in the audience who are much more expert on those issues than I am. So what I will try to do today is provide more of an overarching academic discussion of what I think are the key issues at hand, and I hope you find them useful for your conference. So let me begin, if I may. Let's see. I want to start by looking at issues of language and national identity, and this was one of the key issues that I addressed in the book that was referred to, Language and Minority Rights. And so I'll come back to that because it has implications also, I think, or I will argue at least, for globalization, and particularly the role of English as an international language. There are lots of interconnections and some of the same patterns that I think influence and impact most often negatively on Indigenous and minority languages. So let me start with two key questions that are often raised in relation to issues of language and national identity. The first is whether speaking the national language is or should be a requirement of national citizenship. And so that is often an issue that's associated particularly with new migrants who need to or are required to learn most often the national language, but it also impacts directly on those languages, Indigenous languages, and what we term in the literature national minority languages, which have always been associated with a particular territory, but have become minoritized because of wider processes of colonization, confederation, or colonialism, or some combination of all three. And so this question of the relationship between national languages and national minority and Indigenous languages is very closely related to wider discussions of citizenship. So that's the first question. The second question is a related one, which is whether this requirement should be at the expense of or in addition to the maintenance of minority or non-dominant languages. And what I will go on to speak about in the time that I have with you is that, generally speaking, particularly in the last few hundred years, and particularly in the era of nationalism, we have seen a very strong tendency towards replacing other minority languages with the national language rather than a more complementary approach. And I'll come back to the latter towards the end of my presentation. And so what I've just foregrounded really is that because of those tendencies, both those questions tend to be answered with the following answer, that public monolingualism in the national language, or at most a highly limited public or a public bilingualism or multilingualism, is generally what most nation states today pursue. And as I'll outline, this is a direct legacy of nationalism and the nation state model, which has only been with us really for the last few hundred years, but has become the normative, the normal social and political context around the world. So let me unpack this a little bit further, and I'm going to draw your attention to a number of key English language publications that have come out in recent years, which I hope you might find useful and informative, and might follow up yourself if you do so. But I want to begin with this recent book by David Gramling, entitled The Invention of Monolingualism, a very interesting interdisciplinary look at how public monolingualism, as I've just referred to, has come to be so wide-reaching, so pervasive in this modern world. And what he describes in this book is that whether we opt to call it a myth, a pathology, a paradigm, a relic, or a sham, monolingualism is woven into modernity's most minute and sophisticated political structures. And I'll outline how that is so shortly. He also observes that monolingualism's underlying principle has never quite been that other languages are bad or inferior, I would somewhat disagree with him on that point. I think they are often constructed as bad or inferior, but that's a moot point. But I think his larger observation is that monolingualism regards them as contextually unnecessary. Monolingualism manages other languages, it doesn't oppose them, and in managing them, it often consigns them to the periphery. So let me now turn to why this is in the history of nationalism in particular. I should say that we are coming into summer here in New Zealand, and this is a very hot night, and so I'm trying to remain cool and collected as I do this presentation, but the temperature is warm. So let me come back to the history of language and the nation state, and particularly the issue of what is termed nation-state congruence, which really is what underpins modern social and political organization as a result of the influence of nationalism over the last few centuries. And nation-state congruence is a particularly important term in the sociology of nationalism, particularly outlined by key commentators like Ernest Gellner and Benedict Anderson, among others. And what nation-state congruence is, in effect, is that it presumes that the boundaries of political and national identity should coincide. The view here is that people who are citizens of a particular state should also ideally be members of the same national collectivity, the same national population. And if they are to be the same nationality, they should also, by extension, speak the same national language. And the result of that principle, which underpins, as I said, almost all modern social and political organization, including, I'll go on to suggest, in the Russian Federation, the result of that is an emphasis on linguistic homogeneity, or public monolingualism, as I described it earlier. And that is a very powerful and pervasive principle underpinning how we experience living in nation states. And so how is this achieved? In my book, Language and Minority Rights, which was referred to earlier, I talk about two processes that see how or result in national languages becoming established as the public languages of nation states. The first process is a legal one, and it doesn't always apply. You don't have to have a language legally recognized in your constitution, for example, for it to be the dominant national language in the UK, in the United Kingdom, in the USA, and also in New Zealand, which follows both of those legislative arrangements. English is the dominant language, but it's not an official language. They see no need to make it official. It's a de facto rather than de jure national language. But the key is that irrespective of whether it has official status or not, it's related to and seen as an instrument or an arm of the state. But probably the most, or the more important process is this process of institutionalization, which is really normalizing the language within civil society, within all of the key institutions of civil society, and particularly education, but not limited to that. So institutionalization refers to the process by which the language comes to be accepted or taken for granted in a wide range of social, cultural, and linguistic domains or contexts, both formal and informal. In the history of nationalism, as I said, education, particularly mass education, has been central to this process, and also the military, in terms of a language of common communication, is another very influential area. And of course, civic and civic administration is often, or almost solely in many instances, conducted in the national language, or sometimes rarely, but still there are a number of states which have more than one national language. But effectively, most national languages, as I said, are either single national languages or very limited range of national languages in a given context. And this process, as many of you will know if you are involved in language policy, is achieved by language standardization, so selecting a particular language variety as the national language, codifying that via by dictionaries, for example, and other means, elaborating the language, particularly in terms of vocabulary expansion, and then implementing, as I said, the language as a language of civic or civil society. And so those processes, again, I suggest, occur across a wide range of modern nation states today. So what are the implications of that? Why is that important, and how is it relevant to the focus of your very important and timely conference? Well, because I argue those processes immediately place majority language speakers at an advantage over other groups, because their language is normalized in the public domain. And as first language speakers of the state language, majority language speakers have greater access to and control over the resources and machinery of the state. So they are inherently advantaged as first language speakers of the dominant national language. And I won't read all of this quote. I'll leave this, and I'll leave my PowerPoint for you also to refer to later if you find it interesting. But the legal jurist, Fernand de Varenne, who is also currently the rapporteur for minority rights for the United Nations, observed in a very influential book on international law in the mid-1990s exactly this point, that by imposing a language requirement, the state shows a definite preference towards individuals on the basis of language. And so the imposition of a single language for use in state activities and services is not a neutral act, nor can it ever be. For those for whom the chosen state speech is not their primary language, they end up being relatively disadvantaged and treated differently from those for whom it is. And that's why the process of establishing national languages and requiring their use, particularly at the expense of other languages, which is a corollary to the politics of nationalism, which is often present, and particularly, as I'll go on to outline, in relation to Indigenous languages. That process of language replacement further disadvantages other language speakers in those contexts. Now, in terms of my own work, I've drawn on a range of theoretical influences. One of them in particular, the French anthropologist and sociologist Pierre Bourdieu, who I find very useful in terms of discussing these concepts. And he has written widely about this in relation to his own state, France, particularly, and how the Langue d'Oil, Northern French, which was actually the French, the language of the King's Court, ironically, was with the establishment of the French Revolution, became the language of France over time. Nearly took 2 centuries to establish it as the state language, because at the time of the French Revolution, there were at least 8 other languages spoken throughout the territory we now know as France. They include Occitan, Catalan, Basque, which Yosoni will talk about in her presentation towards the end of the conference, Midi Provençal in the middle, German on the borders of the French and German border, Corsican, which was the language of Napoleon, the first language of Napoleon, among others. So at the time of the French Revolution, there were a whole range of languages spoken in what we know now as France, and the process of nationalism, of which France is an exemplar, saw one language variety become the language of France, and those other languages relegated to what was termed patois or dialects. And now, as a result, in the current age, less than 2% of French of France, 2% of the French population speak languages other than French. And so Bourdieu's analysis of this, his analytical analysis, is encapsulated in this observation. In order for one national language to impose itself as the only legitimate one, he uses this notion of a unified linguistic market. The market has to be unified, and thus different dialects, whatever they may be, of class, region, or ethnic group, have to be measured against that national language, often negatively. And again, the corollary is that there is a very strong political and social pressure to integrate into that national community and come to speak, often at the expense of the languages you already know, the national language. And again, very briefly, he goes on to state that other language varieties are often therefore peripheralized. They come to be seen as sort of regional languages, as dialect, as indigenous languages that are not fit for common purpose or the modern age, as they are often constructed. And as a result, these minority languages tend over time not only to become peripheralized in terms of who speaks them, but also those communities themselves often end up shifting from speaking those languages over time to speaking instead and using the national language. So as Florian Kulnas, another key sociolinguistic commentator on these kinds of processes, observes, the nation state as it has evolved since the French Revolution is the natural enemy of minorities and minority languages, including those, as Nancy Dorian also observes, those small communities and the many indigenous languages in the world today. And just more broadly, and by digression, if we think of the roughly 7,000 languages that are spoken in the world today, if we measure them, for example, via Ethnologue, which is a very effective platform for looking at the world's languages currently, we note that 3% of the world's population, a very small percentage, speak 96% of the world's languages. And that within that 3%, of course, many, around the 250 to 300 million indigenous peoples around the world. And other work that I'm involved in, although I won't speak about it today, emphasizes that as a result of that, many of the world's languages may no longer be spoken within the next century. So we are seeing what Tove Skotnapkangas, the Finnish sociolinguist, calls linguistic genocide. The fact that many of the world's languages will no longer be spoken, along with the cultural knowledge that they embody within the next century. So that's the power of nationalism in the modern nation state. And what's I find particularly problematic about it, apart from the fact that it's leading to the demise of many of the world's languages, is that it's in effect a social and political fiction. The sociologist Walker Connor describes this clearly when he notes that there are very few nation states that are actually at the individual level monolingual. So while public monolingualism might be seen as the norm, private language use is invariably at minimum bilingual and often multilingual. And so there is a disjuncture, a gap between the multilingualism of many of our populations and the public monolingualism of the national language. And also languages and populations change over time, and they rise and fall depending on political and social circumstances. If we take as an example that I often use, if we look at Danish, Norwegian and Swedish, which are relatively adjacent to the Russian Federation. In the 18th century, Norwegian, well, Swedish rather, was regarded as a dialect of Danish. Norwegian was subsequently regarded as a dialect of Swedish. And it was only when Norway gained its political independence that Norwegian, or the two varieties of Norwegian, were classified as Norwegian. Much more recently, we've seen similar processes in relation to Croatian and Kosovan and Serbian and others. So really it's the politics of state making that determines whether a language is designated as such or whether it's not, irrespective of how close those language varieties might be. And it reminds me of a quote which I think is attributed to the sociolinguist Einar Hogan, who said that languages are dialects with an army and a navy. And so the key issue is that we don't distinguish language varieties on the basis of linguistic closeness, but on the basis of whether they are recognized by states. And then much more recently in this era of globalization, which I'll return to, we're also seeing a proliferation of diversity among migrants, particularly in major urban cities around the world. And this process has been termed superdiversity by the British sociologist Steven Verdevec. And he highlights that migration patterns and transmigration patterns have changed considerably, particularly over the last 50 years or so, with much greater to and fro, much greater diversity within, as I said, particularly large urban centres, and therefore much bilingualism and multilingualism at the individual level. Again, a clear disjuncture, a clear gap between the ideal, or the so-called ideal of a public monolingualism and the reality of people's multilingual lives. And as I'll come back to briefly, the political theorist Will Kimlicka also talks about the fact that this idea of public monolingualism is a political fiction, because he identifies, as I said earlier, national minorities, or what he calls multinational populations, those that have always been in a particular historical territory, including indigenous peoples, and polyethnic populations, those new migrants, particularly in this age of superdiversity. And he observes rather obviously that most countries in the world have historically and remain today a combination of those two. So my point here is the demographics of modern nation states and the ways that we particularly tend to engage in everyday life, particularly for the majority of the world who are multilingual, quite different from this supposed public monolingualism. So that's the nation state model. Let me turn now to sort of parallel discussions in political theory, particularly around language and citizenship. And I won't belabor this because I want to go on in the time that I have remaining to how we might reconceptualize things somewhat. But let me just briefly talk this through. So we see two dominant positions in discussions of language and citizenship. One again focuses on public monolingualism, and it's seen because of the idea that citizenship is individual and that everyone is thus treated the same. And so issues of cultural and linguistic identity, and particularly cultural and linguistic difference, are simply ignored. And so this allows for and supports the establishment of national languages such as Russian, as I've previously discussed. And it's quite different from previous forms of political organizations. So empires, for example, which were present throughout the first and second millennium, were often resolutely multilingual, not only privately, but also publicly. If we think of the Ottoman Empire, for example, and also even the Roman Empire, which, while it required Latin as the administrative language, was quite laissez-faire, quite open about allowing the use of other languages in the public domain within the regions that it administered, as long as taxes were paid to Caesar, all was well. So empires have quite a different historical trajectory in terms of languages, and they were much more open to public as well as private multilingualism. And then the other notion that's advocated in discussions of political theory is the sociolinguistic concept of diglossia, which allows for private multilingualism in low status language domains, such as the family, community, again, in areas that are generally not recognized or supported by the nation state publicly. And this is where currently many minority languages, including local indigenous languages, can be seen. I give another example just as a counterpoint in terms of China. For example, there are at least 130 languages and dialects in China that are in this situation. And I'll come back to the counterpoint with Russia, with the Russian Federation shortly. And then just a little bit of history in relation to language policy. what we've seen in terms of the management of multilingualism, and particularly language policy in modern nation states, and the academic discussions of language policy over the last 50 or so years, is that originally language policy was very much geared towards the so-called management of languages, particularly for post-colonial states. And again, we see similar processes established here, where majority, generally ex-colonial languages, became the national language. They were promoted as the language of wider communication. And again, minority, local, indigenous languages were relegated to the private domain. This is the diglossic situation that we find still today in many contexts. And as a result, early language policy and planning tended to avoid directly addressing social and political matters within which language change, use and development, and indeed language planning itself, are embedded. So again, they viewed these processes largely as neutral and unproblematic, when in fact they are deeply imbricated with history and politics and social and political organization, particularly, as I've argued, the politics of nationalism. So this is just paused on me for some reason. Let me just see what exactly is happening here. I might just need to exit my PowerPoint to see what's happening here. So let's look at the history of the Soviet Union, particularly prior to the Russian Federation. I raise this because in some of the academic literature, the Soviet Union is often described as taking an imperial approach, a more sort of public multilingual approach reminiscent of empires to minority languages. And this was particularly evident in the formal endorsement of multilingualism among its constituent territories under Stalin. However, if we look at closer analysis, what we find over time, and I'll be interested particularly in your comments and questions as to whether I have this right, but the Soviet approach historically still seemed, it appears, to have largely privileged the use of Russian in all formal contexts, and in effect established these diglossic situations which I've just described. And the close association of Russian with the wider goal of creating an homogeneous Soviet socialist nation also resulted in Russian replacing other languages over time. So, for example, by 1979, about 16.3 million non-Russians had shifted to Russian as their first language. And then if we look at the Russian Federation, as I understand it, around 40 nations are classified as minor indigenous peoples of Russia, primarily in the north, in Siberia and the Far East. And they, as I've said earlier, because of the plight that are facing many indigenous languages, we are seeing extensive language shift and loss, and a number of indigenous nations and their languages on the brink of extinction. And of those approximately 180,000 indigenous people, as I understand it, living in 28 regions of the Russian Federation, we see again a usual process where more and more children are no longer learning or speaking their indigenous languages. In the north, there are indigenous languages with higher rates of language maintenance, as indicated there, but other indigenous languages within the Russian Federation have much lower rates, particularly Sami, among others. And elsewhere, there are significant indigenous populations, not least in Tatarstan, which also interestingly has supporting indigenous media and quite a significant online web-based presence in terms of those languages. But generally speaking, many of these indigenous languages, as they are elsewhere, tend to be at significant risk. All right, so turning briefly to the question of globalization, my basic argument here, and I'm going to shorten this because of the time that we have remaining, and I'll try and paraphrase this as quickly and as simply as I can. My basic argument is that those processes of nationalism are now seen writ large in relation to globalization, and particularly the globalization of English as the current lingua mundi, or world language. We've seen particularly the rise of English as an additional language since the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, and particularly across Central and Eastern Europe. And that has, in many ways, cemented the ongoing dominance of English as a current world language. And that has been supported by its close association with geopolitical globalization, the rise of capitalism and the influence of capitalism, particularly over the 20th and now the 21st century, and the influence of geocultural globalization via the media, via popular culture, and other forms, and the internet, where English, again, because of geopolitical circumstances, has tended to dominate. So over 80% of internet traffic, for example, is in English. So both of those processes have contributed to as English as a world language. And the argument here, among many, even multilingual commentators, is the idea that globalization now proceeds in English. And so my suggestion here is that the diglossia that I described at the national level is in effect now happening with English at the international level. English is populating the most prestigious language domains, and even national languages now are perhaps at threat in terms of being seen in that diglossic context. And so the political theorist Abraham de Swan notes that people will have to live with both English and their domestic language and seek a feasible accommodation between the two. This is the book that he makes this argument, a 2001 book. And what's interesting here is he rates the world's languages in terms of what he describes as their Q value. And this value is based on the communicative reach, significance, and perceived usefulness of the language. So from that, he identifies what he describes as central languages, around 100, predominantly national languages, supercentral languages, 12 or so, including Russian, but only one, what he describes as hypercentral language, an overarching world language, English. Now I'm going to not discuss Philip Van Parijs in any great detail, and I'm going to skip a couple of slides shortly, but let me just summarize another political theorist's more recent contribution. De Swan's book was published in 2001, and Philippe Van Parijs, the Belgian political theorist, published this book, Linguistic Justice for Europe and for the World, in 2011. And here's a similar process where he talks about the prevalence or how widespread a language is. He talks about motivation and opportunity to speak those languages, and English is ascendant in both of those. And as a result, particularly of the close links with language and globalization in a high mobility and intense communication world, he proposes this principle, which he terms the maxi-min principle, which is that basically whenever you get a group of people together, the default language of communication becomes the language which most of those people understand, even if their grasp of the language is not strong. And so basically the maxi-min principle, he argues, again favors English because English speakers tend to be monolingual. And so when they are in a group, no matter how multilingual that group might be, the group will tend to switch to the language that includes the most participants, and in this case, English. So it's broadly the same as de Swan's analysis in terms of associating globalization, particularly with English, as the dominant global language in the most prestigious language domains, and as I said, national languages and certainly even indigenous and minority languages more so become lower down in the hierarchy. This is the second edition of the book that was mentioned earlier. It has a different cover, and it came out in late 2011, early 2012. But in it, and in the time that I have remaining, I just want to basically outline what I think are some potential alternatives to the processes of linguistic homogeneity at both the national and the global level that so affect often negatively and often extensively minority languages, particularly indigenous languages. And the first point really to make, and I'm just, as I said, going to summarize this because of time, is that language policy and decisions are never neutral. They are always situated within socio-historical and socio-political contexts of power at the national level, as we've seen with the influence of political nationalism and modern nation-state congruence or organization over the last 300 or 400 years, and increasingly in a globalized world dominated by English, the same patterns at a global level. And one of the arguments that's regularly employed, particularly in terms of globalization, is the idea that English, is the new language of communication, the language of social and political and economic mobility, the cosmopolitan language, that with English, we can not only engage in our national context, but with the world. And this has sometimes been paraphrased as the frequent flyer view of identity. But as the sociologist Craig Calhoun observes, those who advocate this kind of linguistic cosmopolitanism ignore issues of inequality that make such identities and the languages that they have available to them accessible mainly to elites rather than to anyone else. And so this tends to reinforce social and linguistic hierarchies rather than obviate them. And so as a result, one of the key things I argue in my book, Language and Minority Rights, is that when we talk about language rights and language policy, we always have to think of the historical context, which is why I briefly discussed, and I look forward to being corrected if I have anything wrong, the history of both the Soviet Union's language policy and the Russian Federation's current language policies. And similarly with English, we need to situate it historically in terms of its socio and political context. The other key issue, and again, I'm not going to belabor this, but I'll just speak briefly to it, is that often, particularly those arguing for English as a global language, treat it as a homogeneous, as a uniform category, whereas what we know is that there are many different varieties of English spoken in different contexts and for different purposes, and those varieties of English are still hierarchicized, so they still sit within linguistic hierarchies. So there are world Englishes such as Indian English, I assume Russian English, and other forms of English which will be accented and for which so-called native speakers of English will view them still somewhat differently. And then there are also, particularly in post-colonial contexts, what the sociolinguist Jan Blomet calls low mobility forms of English, which might be a range or a translanguaging combination of a variety of language varieties, including English, that are used, for example, for local trade purposes, but which would not be deemed valuable or prestigious in other contexts, particularly where there are first language speakers of English. So the idea that English as a global language can provide social economic mobility, that it is the new cosmopolitan language, as many particularly political theorists argue, I want to suggest is a very problematic position that doesn't hold with history and with the socio-political contexts. And so again, just very briefly, if we look at this interrogation a little further in terms of the idea of language and mobility, and particularly the use of English as the new language of wider communication, we still see in contexts where English is used a disjuncture between the rhetoric and the reality. So in India, while it's being used more and more as a form of outsourcing, for example, academic publishing, as many of you may well know, now often comes out of India in this process of business process outsourcing and information technology outsourcing, because multinational publishers obviously find it cheaper to publish out of India. But nonetheless, those who are in those positions are generally existing social elites within India who have access to high prestige status English language varieties. Similarly in Africa, although there are a wide number of African states that have English as an official or co-official language, in almost all of those states, there are only a very small minority, a very small percentage of English speakers. So language policy and actual demographics tend again to be seen as a gap. And I've already talked about low mobility forms of English, the way that particular language varieties are stigmatized. And so, again, another political theorist who does very interesting work in language policy, Peter Ives, the Canadian Peter Ives, notes of this more generally, that learning English or any dominant language is not inherently detrimental in the abstract, but the context in which it occurs often means that it helps to reinforce existing fragmentation, and thus a global language like English can never fulfill the role that cosmopolitanism, the idea of joining the world together via English, sets for it, that of helping those marginalized and oppressed by globalization to be heard. So really what I'm wanting to say in relation to these debates within political theory is that they parallel the problematic assumptions that we see in relation to national languages and nation-state congruence. And then just to summarize this and to move on and to conclude, what I'm suggesting here is that when we view languages as only vehicles of communication, and this is how English, for example, is currently constructed in relation to globalization, that's a very reductionist view of language. It doesn't address issues of the connections between language and identity. It doesn't address issues of language and knowledge retention and cultural knowledge that's often encapsulated and related to the languages one speaks. It doesn't see linguistic diversity as an asset, but rather as an obstacle, because communication, or being able to communicate most widely, going back to Van Parijs's Maximin principle, is seen as the objective, and communication breakdown is seen as a problem. So when we see it only as a communicative vehicle, it reinforces these linguistic hierarchies. And then, as I've also pointed out, often these arguments are based on a monolithic view of languages rather than recognizing the widely different language varieties that are present, and fails, as I've said, to address issues of inequality, inequity, and the link between prestige language varieties, particularly, and existing social elites. And then the opposite of that, of course, is an argument, if we take this approach of instrumentalism, is that minority languages and indigenous languages in particular, if one pursues this argument, are then constructed as not useful, and that national languages and or English as the global language should be used instead, should replace those languages, hence the language shift and loss that we are seeing in the world today. And even when minority and indigenous languages are seen, often in state-mandated legislation, for example, as important for identity purposes, for example, or cultural continuity is another phrase that's often used. Nonetheless, they are still constructed largely as not particularly useful languages. And so in my own work in language and minority rights, what I argue is that the best and perhaps the only way that such languages can be maintained and revitalized over time is when they are accorded not just private recognition, but public recognition and support via, for example, being used as a language of education. So really extending to other language varieties at least some degree of state support and recognition. It inevitably won't be as much as a national language or a global language like English, but we need to have at least some state recognition and administrative support and use for those languages if they are going to survive over time. And then drawing this to a close, there, as I've said, there are more recent debates around the growing demographic and multilingual nature of the world today, particularly this notion of superdiversity. And I'm sure Yasone Chenos will talk about this in her presentation, the growing rise of the multilingual turn, the recognition that multilingualism is the norm in everyday language use, and therefore we should apply that norm to our understanding of language teaching and learning, rather than, as we have done up until now, conceived language teaching and learning largely in the same monolingual terms as I've described about national languages. And so that is where we are currently in terms of those debates. In my own work, I've drawn this together by using Will Kimlicka, whom I referred to earlier, and his idea that we can recognize national minorities and provide them with language rights because they've always been historically associated with the territory, including Indigenous peoples, and that we can even extend some public recognition of languages to ethnic minorities or migrants where numbers warrant. And so it's not that you would do it for every group, but where there are a sufficient number of language speakers, you might provide some state support for them. And I draw also on the sociolinguist Heinz Kloss in terms of his distinction between tolerance-orientated and promotion-orientated language rights. Tolerance-orientated rights are those that allow other language speakers to continue to use their languages in diglossic contexts in the home and the community, generally without state intervention or punishment, although there are some contexts currently in the world where that continues, for example, in relation to Kurdish in modern-day Turkey, among others. And promotion-orientated language rights are really what I've been referring to throughout this presentation, where we accord public support for other languages, primarily through education, but can also be through other state administrative means. And that's because we have a reasonable expectation in international and national law for other language speakers to have some form, at least, of state support. So this is the summary that Kimlicka outlines. Multinational rights apply to, as I said, national minorities and Indigenous peoples. Polyethnic rights, usually on the basis of where numbers warrant, can still apply to migrants. And Kloss, who I've talked about, distinguishes, as I've said, between private tolerant-oriented rights and public promotion-oriented rights. And much of the work going on currently in language rights internationally is looking at how we can encourage and extend promotion-oriented rights to national minorities, particularly in Indigenous peoples. As I've said, this can be on the basis of reasonableness. The state has a reasonable duty of care to support other languages, and also on the notion of where numbers warrant. So just let me conclude. Really what I've tried to do today, and as I said, I'll be interested in your observations and questions and comments in relation to how accurately my analysis reflects the current context in the Russian Federation and other areas where you might work. But really what I'm arguing is that the history of nationalism and now the construction of globalization and its intrinsic or its apparently intrinsic links with English as a global language reinforces a unidirectional view that sees Indigenous and minority languages inevitably replaced by more dominant national languages in the case of nation states, and increasingly English as an international language as well. And so we see for minorities and Indigenous peoples always a movement from their languages, away from their languages, to national and international languages. What I've also tried to outline is that the arguments that are often employed for that very unidirectional and replacement view of languages are based on false assumptions, a very simplistic view about the relationship between language and social mobility. And I'll give you an example from my own context, because I'm aware that while saying that I'm from Aotearoa, New Zealand, I haven't really spoken about the New Zealand context at all. So I'll just give you a very brief personal example as I draw this to a close. So the Indigenous language in Aotearoa, New Zealand is Te Reo Māori, the Māori language, spoken by about 160 to 200,000 people currently, to varying degrees of fluency. But like many Indigenous languages, it is at risk. There have been 30 to 40 years where it has been the language of education again, or at least an aspect of education, and that has been crucial in maintaining and revitalizing it. But it still remains relatively at risk. And there is also, interestingly, still quite strong opposition towards its ongoing maintenance and revitalization. And the argument here is the one that I just precisely outlined, where many opponents of the Māori language say, well, it's not useful. You know, French and German are much more useful international languages. So what we see here is the notion of language usefulness being equated or elided with reach, international reach. And this is again another reason why English is particularly privileged among all other languages currently. My argument in the New Zealand context is, well, actually, that's not the case. Aside from English, which is clearly dominant in New Zealand, the Māori language is the most widely spoken language currently, and it's the only Indigenous language in New Zealand. For both those reasons, it's incredibly useful to know and use the Māori language in New Zealand in everyday life, where we would use it much more regularly and much more directly on an everyday basis than some of those other so-called international languages. And that same premise, I suggest, can be applied to Indigenous languages within particular territories anywhere in the world. And it's not to say that they would be used solely for those purposes. They will almost always be used in conjunction with national and sometimes international languages. But there's no reason why those languages should be replaced rather than being seen as complementary. And that's because we need to reconnect issues of language and identity with understandings of language use and usefulness. It's not just a pragmatic or reductionist view of language use. It's the importance of language identity alongside it. Majority language speakers, Russian speakers in your context, I presume, English speakers in my context, never think of language in relation to identity because we never have to. But of course, our use of language is just as important to our identity as it is to other language speakers. It's just that because it's the dominant language, it's normalized and often invisible. And so in much of my work, what I'm arguing is that we need to have a much more multi-directional view, that we need to accommodate multiple linguistic identities. Most of us in the world, possibly as much as 70, 80%, are multilingual. And so we use those languages widely on an everyday basis and for different purposes and in relation to different interlocutors, different people, and in different contexts. And we do that every day. And so we have multiple often linguistic identities, and there's no reason why we can't also have that in relation to the retention and maintenance and expansion, hopefully, of Indigenous languages and identities. And that also means, though, that we do need to address the issue of state or meaningful state and public recognition of languages so that we don't end up simply reinforcing the widespread notion of diglossia, because when minority and Indigenous languages are only used in low status private domains, language shift and loss still inevitably occurs over time because those languages come to be internalized by their speakers as delimited, as not particularly useful. And so my argument, as I've said, is that we need to rethink that by celebrating not only the national and the global, but also at the same time, the local. And so I finish with this. This is the sociolinguist Suresh Kanagaraja in a very interesting book on local and global languages in 2005, who just comments here in relation to maintaining that multi-directional view of languages, that we should celebrate local knowledge, and that in so doing, this doesn't lead to ghettoizing minority communities or forcing them into an ostrich-like intellectual existence. This is often how critics of ongoing minority and Indigenous language use construct these languages, as if they are ghettoizing or closing off those communities. But rather, a clear grounding in our location gives us the confidence to engage with knowledge from other areas as we deconstruct and reconstruct them for our own purposes. In the sense, then, such an epistemological practice would and should lead us beyond the global and local dichotomy. So to conclude, I'm really just arguing, and I leave this as a basis for your own ongoing discussions in this very important and timely conference, as I said at the start, that we need to talk about, consider, act, analyze, and discuss in relation to both academic, but also crucially policy developments. We should have the underpinning principle and idea that we are always dealing with languages in a multi-directional flow from the local to the national and the global, but also across and between those differences, rather than always seeing minority languages being replaced by national languages being replaced by international languages. Only when we adopt that much more multi-directional view will we be able to have any chance of saving the majority of the world's indigenous languages over the course of the next 100 years. Thank you very much, Ms. Vidania, for your time and attention, and I look forward to your observations and comments. I look forward to you correcting me on anything that I may have got wrong. And as I said, I wish you all the very best for the remainder of your conference. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Professor May, for your very interesting, very informative and thought-provoking presentation. So we have 15 minutes for questions and discussion. So let's see. Yes. Andrei Alexandrovich has a question, please. Turn on the microphone, please, Andrei Alexandrovich.
Yeah, thanks so much, Professor May, for participating and for giving this very rich talk. I learned a lot. I think I will make a brief comment and ask a question. It's obvious that this domain of language policies is difficult. It's a difficult research area. And I definitely agree with your point that we need to develop more elaborate, more complex reasoning about all these topics. But it seems there is some contradiction between the complexity of the issue and the need to explain the problems to public officials in a relatively simple way. In particular, today in my when introducing the forum, I mentioned briefly that there is currently a task in the Russian Federation to develop the so-called concept of language policy. And our institute and a number of other academic institutes have proposed a variant to the administration of the president. And the reaction was positive, but at the same time, they said that we are writing in a very complicated way, and it's hard to grasp what linguists are saying. So how do you think this contradiction can be resolved in practical terms?
Well, that's the nub of the challenge, isn't it? I think if we think back to the sort of three principal domains of language policy, and we think of status planning, which is what I focused on primarily in this discussion, the sort of relationship between and among languages, particularly in the socio-political domain. We need to address that first, I think, and particularly the sort of the implicit and explicit notion that often underpins state language planning, which is the replacement model that I've mentioned. The idea that we can maintain a variety of languages at the same time without replacing one with the other, I think is the most direct and simplest argument that we first need to make. And then in terms of policy application, if we think of acquisition planning, particularly the role of education, I think education is critical. I'm aware, and I need to say this carefully, that education cannot in itself save or revitalize the language. We know that from our own context here in New Zealand. But it is nonetheless a critical arena in which a language can have public support. So I think one of the key points of focus in language policy development is to focus on the possibilities of Indigenous language bilingual education, rather than, as in most contexts, education only in the dominant national language. And then in terms of overall language revitalization aims, of course, corpus language planning, and particularly language standardization, language vocabulary for those minority and Indigenous languages at risk also need to be addressed. So there are multiple levels, and that's why I understand and completely agree with you that it's very demanding. it's very dependent on the presumptions, often deeply embedded, of local politicians and policy actors. But I think if we see it in those three principal aims, status language planning in terms of contesting the replacement principle, acquisition language planning in terms of foregrounding education as a key space in civic society where languages can be given public recognition, that notion of promotion-oriented rights, and corpus language planning in terms of sustaining Indigenous and minority languages over time. They all need to be addressed concurrently, but they can also be addressed separately depending on the context and the particular priorities at the time. Hope that answers that to some extent.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Artem Fedorinchik has a question. Please, Artem.
Yeah, thank you very much. You have said a lot about English, but I think the situation now is a little bit more complicated because of very high potential of Chinese economy and Chinese language. In your opinion, how the right of the Chinese language can change the linguistic landscapes and linguistic perspective of minority languages?
Thank you, that's a very good question. Well, can I historicize that for a start in the sense that there have been other languages over time that have been world languages. Think of Latin, obviously, which is now only ever taught occasionally in schools. Greek, or at least classical Greek, and we think of the Persian Empire and over time. And so the fact that English is the current world language doesn't necessarily mean that it will remain so, because again, my key point is that languages rise and fall not on their linguistic merits, but on the socio-historical and socio-political context, which privileges them and their speakers. In relation to the relationship with Chinese, particularly in its standardized form of Mandarin, we see a very similar process, just out of interest, in terms of the dominance of Mandarin in relation to other language varieties, exactly the same process that's occurred over time. And we know that Chinese remains the language by far with the most number of speakers. But I think one of the key reasons bolstering the ongoing influence and reach of English vis-a-vis other languages, including Chinese, going back to De Swan's distinction between supercentral language, of which Russian and Chinese are identified as such, and English is the hypercentral language, is that English is increasingly, as I said, the language of choice as an additional language. And that again is part of the geopolitics of the changes in political structure in Central and Eastern Europe in the European context. And the ongoing, at least for now, until it perhaps implodes, the ongoing geopolitical influence of the US and the close association of English currently with globalization, the internet, public and popular culture. But you're right, I think it could well be the case in the foreseeable future that Mandarin may end up taking over, as have other languages, but that's not something that we can foresee at this point. But I hope that answers that question.
Yes, thank you very much. Ekaterina Gruzdeva, please.
Yes, thank you very much for your presentation. I agree with most of your points, but I have a question to a more probably practical one. So even if we take a multidirectional view on the processes you are describing, even if we suggest multilingual education for, or provide multilingual education for minority peoples, we still have a kind of very big inequality between those for whom, in, for instance, Russian context, Russian is a native language, and those who have to be multilingual in this context, so who have to put much more effort in preserving their language, in learning their language. So we cannot force those for whom dominant language is a native one to learn other languages. How many English-speaking people are ready to study Maori in New Zealand? I expect not very many. So the same is in many other countries. So then we have English on the top of that, which creates another inequality with those who speak English as a native language. So people give up their languages sometimes voluntarily, so they prefer to, in Russian context, to speak Russian, not because they're forbidden to speak their own language, but because they think about Russian as a tool for their future life, for their children, and so on. So what should we do? How can we really plan the prestige of a certain language in order to maintain it, in order to keep it alive in such a context of inequality of different languages? So thank you. I understand this is not an easy question, but still.
Yeah, thanks for that. It remains a significant challenge. I've talked about drawing on the work of, and initially the work of the language economist, Swiss language economist Francois Greux, and his notion of tolerability, which is that for minority and indigenous language revitalization, maintenance, state supported policies to work or to be accepted at all, a key is that majority language speakers need to tolerate it, and as a result move over time from their own monolingualism and their associated power and prestige as a result of that monolingualism to a more equitable bilingual or multilingual context. And again, I'm sure Sonia will talk about this in relation to Basque in Spain, but we have ongoing debates in the Spanish context currently among majority, often monolingual Spanish speakers in the federal part of Spain, often conservative, who argue vociferously against Catalan and Basque and other language autonomies on the basis that somehow bilingualism is seen as a threat to the state. So that's the other thing that I haven't talked about today, but because national languages are so closely associated with citizenship and integration, and minority languages have been so closely associated with not just being peripheral, but also as potential threats to the state. That's been another reason why it's been so difficult to change the current sort of language policies. In terms of your question in relation to New Zealand, about 2% of Pākehā New Zealanders, white New Zealanders, speak Māori, but it is starting to change as Māori becomes more established, not only within education, but also in the media. And so this notion of tolerability is a key to that. It seems, although there remains resistance to it, there also seems to be a nascent, wider acceptance of Te Reo Māori, not only as a language of identity, but also a language of common use. So I think the key challenge, coming back to your question, is that we need to somehow shift people's attitudes toward acknowledging that minority and indigenous languages are important not only for identity purposes, but also for everyday life. And I'll give you one more example of this in relation to my research in Wales. Did my PhD on Welsh language policy. And the arguments there were very similar when Welsh was starting to be supported as a language of education in the first instance. And it became, through a political accident that I won't go into, as a part of Margaret Thatcher's regime at the time, it became established as a foundational language of the Welsh curriculum. And parents, particularly on the eastern border of Wales, the border most adjacent to England, employed exactly the arguments that I mentioned earlier, that Welsh is a completely useless language. I want my children to learn French or German, and I don't want them to be forced to learn Welsh because it's of no value in use. But 20, 30 years later, Welsh is now a language of civic administration. And in order to be a civil servant in Wales and a teacher, you tend to need to be bilingual. And so ironically, we get now the opposite argument, which is that basically monolingual majority language speakers see this as somehow language, as an example of language oppression, that they are being required or forced to learn a language that they don't want to. And this is particularly the case for monolingual speakers. And the reason they find this so troubling is because it shifts the linguistic power relationships that they have been so used to, that they've been able to function with equanimity in one language, one dominant language, and now they're not so privileged, particularly if they're not bi or multilingual. So these discussions are always embedded not just in socio-historical and socio-political contexts, but contexts of power and inequality. And so I'm not really answering your question. It's because the challenge remains extremely difficult. But this notion of tolerability, I think, is a key. We see it even in the Catalan context, which has a very strongly established socio-political context now, where Catalan is the normal language of Catalonia. But even so, as I said, some of these Spanish federalists, so-called, are sort of arguing vociferously, and this has been supported by the conservative Spanish Supreme Court, against this kind of recognition of other languages. My simple response to that is that if it's good enough for majority language speakers to have their language and identity recognized and their language supported by the state, then there should be no reason why that can't be extended at least to those other language speakers who've always been historically associated with those particular territories. Because really, if they don't, majority language speakers are simply denying to others the privileges that they themselves enjoy.
Thank you very much, dear colleagues. We should stick to the schedule, I think. So that's why, yes, we can close our discussion. We don't have any opportunity to ask more questions. Yes. Thank you to all the participants and especially to our presenter, Professor May. And yes, you can participate in other sessions which start at noon. Please don't turn off your Zoom. Yeah, see you later.
Okay. Thank you very much, everyone. Enjoy the conference.
Thanks again very much, Professor May, for such a rich participation. And we organized the program so that there is an English language session right after this one. And if you are interested, you are welcome to participate and listen to the talks.
I would love to, depending on how late it is in New Zealand. But thank you very much. It's been a pleasure and a privilege.
Thank you.
Thank you.